The United Nations, informally known as the UN, is the highest existing entity of global unification. Its purpose is clear: to avoid a third world war and to strengthen the cooperation of countries. The UN has made great strides in the integration of countries over the past few years, but it has also remained silent in the face of major unforeseen events such as wars, famines, human rights violations, and has sanctioned entire countries. The UN has great power, but power is not evenly distributed among all its members. Instead, the great power of the UN rests with the 5 member states, the so-called permanent members of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council is the only one of 6 UN bodies that can take executive action in conjunction with the rest of other member states in order to send rescue missions and order a country to carry out such actions, establish sanctions, and in extreme cases, authorize and order the invasion of a country, as was the case in Libya in 2011. The UN Security Council had ordered NATO to carry out bombings within the country. If the UN Security Council does not agree with a resolution, then the action will not be carried out. Even if member states all agree with the resolution, it only takes the veto of one of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to nullify a resolution. It could be argued that 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council has established a form of dictatorship within the organization, approving what is convenient for them, and everything that does not suit them will be discarded. So why do they have so much power? Who agreed to let them have this power? How do they use it? And could this situation ever change in the future? We will dive into all these questions today. Let's begin. The 4 policemen was a key phrase that emerged after the Second World War, while the 4 victorious powers of the war, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, discussed the format of a future super global organization. The Dumbarton Conference was a meeting where France, the UK, China, the Soviet Union, and the US were selected to be the permanent members of an executive body of the UN that could establish peacekeeping operations, sanctions of international organizations, and the authorization of military actions through the resolutions of the Security Council. Thus, it is the only UN body with the authority to issue binding resolutions for the member states. At that time, the United States attempted to include Brazil in order to have another American country on the table and not be dominated by European countries, but this proposal was rejected by the Soviet Union and the UK. It is necessary to understand that at that time, these 5 countries were the economic, political, and military superpowers of the world. They did as they wanted and appointed themselves as overseers of world security. The Security Council of the UN was configured with a total of 15 member states, 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members. In its first 2 decades, the Security Council had 6 non-permanent members. In 1965, the number of non-permanent members was extended to 10. These 10 non-permanent members are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms beginning on January 1st, and 5 are replaced every single year. In order to be approved, a candidate country must receive at least 2/3 of all votes cast for that position. Non-permanent members play an important role within the Security Council, since in order for a resolution to be approved, there must be 9 or more votes in the room, even if a permanent member presented the resolution. But on the other hand, with the veto power held by the 5 permanent members, the opposite occurs. In the negotiations leading up to the creation of the UN, the veto power was viewed with disgust by many small countries, and in fact was imposed by the veto nations through the threat that without their veto, there would be no UN. The big 5 UN members imposed the veto as a necessity. Thus, the 5 powers of that time regulated that any resolution voted on in the UN Security Council would not happen if a permanent member voted against it, but on the contrary, the resolutions would require the necessary votes. Even if all members of the council except one permanent member agreed, the whole resolution would fall apart. They would start from square one. This mechanism has worked since 1946. From that day until today, more than 230 resolutions have been vetoed. 230 resolutions have not passed thanks to the rejection of a single permanent member. In the following chart, you can see all the resolutions that has been banned by the different members of the Security Council. The list is headed by Russia, then the Soviet Union with more than 100 vetoes, followed by the US with about 80, the UK with 29, France with 16, and China has used the veto the least. The veto was mainly used during the Cold War, where the UN Security Council was effectively paralyzed. There were practically 2 sides, the West with the US, France, and the UK, and the Eastern Bloc with China and the Soviet Union, now considered Russia, always blocking resolutions of the other side for its own political and economic interests. This has prevented the UN from acting on urgent matters such as the Syrian civil war, the civil war in Yemen, the Cuban embargo, the illegal occupation of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the addition of Palestine in the UN, and so on. The access of a new member country to the right to vote must also have the endorsement of the 5 permanent member states. It is for that reason, for example, that Palestine is simply an observer member and not a member with voting power, since the US decided on multiple occasions to refuse to admit Palestine as a member due to their ties with Israel. On several occasions, the US, France, UK, and Russia, knowing that a permanent member would veto their resolution, have bypassed all international laws and resorted to force, thus avoiding the United Nations Charter. An example being the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States and the UK, which was an intervention in which Russia and France did not agree with. Another example was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the subsequent annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. Several resolutions rejecting the annexation of Crimea by Russia were rejected by the Russian Federation. In that case, the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is the principal organ of the United Nations, may vote to express its opinion in the form of a recommendation in a resolution. In this case, a resolution that has the majority of the votes will pass. However, they are just that, recommendations. They will not be executory resolutions, as those resolutions are reserved by the Security Council. The General Assembly is the only one of 6 main organs within the UN in which all member countries have the same representation and is the main decision-making body and representation of the UN. This assembly supervises the UN budget, appoints the non-permanent members of the Security Council, they designate the Secretary General of the UN, and they also receive reports from other bodies of the UN and make recommendations in the form of General Assembly resolutions. For example, with regard to their present economic embargo that the US imposes on Cuba, any attempt by the Security Council to force the US to lift the blockade will automatically be vetoed by the United States, for which the UN General Assembly would express its rejection in the form of a resolution condemning the US embargo. Last time, this resolution had more than 180 countries that voted in favor and only 7 against, including the US and Israel. Serious issues such as the slow colonization of Palestine by Israeli settlements have also failed to be resolved due to the US blockade of any resolution that requires or obliges Israel to stop these illegalities. In a historical action and as a sign of deterioration of relations between the Obama administration and Israel, the US abstained from any resolution that condemned Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory and demanded that Israel stopped immediately. However, not 1 month later, Trump took possession of the Oval Office and ratified the total loyalty of the United States to Israel. The Security Council with its 5 permanent members, known as the P5, with veto power no longer represented what the world was like in 1946. Today, these 5 countries continue to be the indisputable economic and military powers, but they are no longer the only ones. Nations such as Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India are 4 giants that accumulate more than 20% of the global GDP and represent more than 1.6 billion people. Today on the planet, there are already more economically important countries than France and the UK, such as Germany or Japan, and new emerging powers such as Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, and Indonesia will be emerging as the new leading nations of tomorrow. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council do not want to lose their veto. So now what? Will they expand this power to other nations? This would give a better representation of the current powers of the world. There are already proposals on the table. Currently, the G4, which consists of Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan, support each other to obtain seats as permanent members of the Security Council. However, any modification to the Magna Carta of the United Nations, which stipulates how many members there are and who they are, must be approved by the Security Council and the consent of the P5. So this is where it becomes problematic. There are P5 members that disagree with the idea of expanding the veto power, as it would be detrimental to their power and influence. The United Kingdom and France have supported the G4 candidacy for permanent positions in the UN Security Council, and Japan has the support of the US and the UK. All the permanent members of the P5 have supported India's candidacy for a permanent seat on the Security Council. The problem is, China had previously implied that it is only ready to support India's candidacy if the deal does not include the inclusion of Japan. This is where the total support for the G4 is blocked, since China does not want to see Japan at the table, a country with which it has several territorial and economic disputes, and on the other hand we have Russia, who refused to admit Germany as a veto power. But from the Russian point of view, this is quite logical. Germany would be another Western European country in the P5, and together with France and the UK, they would block any resolution that goes against the Western European interest. Finally, there would be a lack of countries that are not within the G4, such as Mexico, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and others, nations whose populations grow exponentially and each year occupy a more important role in the global economy. For the sake of the UN and its representation, there must be a reform of the UN Security Council. On the contrary, the control that the 5 powers have over the UN is slowly being reduced thanks to the appearance of new emerging countries. The P5 have applied a sort of dictatorship in the UN, blocking a corridor with no way out for resolutions that go against their interests. It is time that the power becomes more evenly distributed within the UN. In another video, we will talk about the US attacks on the UN and how US President Donald Trump questions its existence and survival. So do you think that the Security Council should be reformed by extending the veto power to other nations, or should this power be dissolved entirely? Is it really necessary for the so-called most influential countries in the world to be in charge of world security? So I hope you like this video and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.